to IDFC Institute Conversations. I have here with me Ambassador Shyam. Thank you for taking the time out to talk with us about your latest book, How India Sees the World. So I have a couple of questions just pertaining to your book. In the first section of the book, you talk about a myth that's actually quite popular here, that the idea of India was probably a legacy of British colonial rule, but it's not so. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
As I have pointed out that there has been a perception even within India that India is something like an artificial construct, that it is really a legacy of the British Empire, that there was no idea of India before that. And I think that's a kind of a perception which needs to be in fact refuted. As I have pointed out that India had a centralized empire covering most of what we geographically know as India, even earlier than China had centralized empire, the Mauryan Empire. And throughout history there have been other empires covering most of what the geography of India is, whether it is the Gupta Empire or the Mughal Empire, and yes, the British Empire itself. So I think it's important to recognize that there has been a sense of India as an identifiable geographical space, as a shared cultural space for several centuries. And this history, the location of India, its geography, the culture of India, its history, all these have actually been very important factors in determining the prism through which India and Indians look at the world, how they engage with the world. So that's the reason why I have the subject that how does India look at the world? Because there is an identifiable prism or an identifiable frame through which India relates to the rest of the world.
You also mentioned that we have some very rich traditional sources of literature on statecraft and diplomacy, primarily Kautilya's Arthashastra. But how would that literature be relevant to use today for India?
Well, we should not use classical historical material in some kind of a mechanical way. But what I wanted to also point out, just as there has been that sense that there was no India before the British, there has also been an argument that India does not have any kind of strategic thinking, that India does not have really a concept of statecraft. In fact, there is a great deal of classical literature which deals with statecraft, and Kautilya is only one of them. And in the manner in which, for example, Kautilya has spoken about, the Mandala theory, that we start with a very simple kind of interrelationship between a country and its neighbors, and then you keep adding on to it until it becomes a very complex set of relationships. Actually, it's a very useful way of looking at international relations. Secondly, what I have also pointed out is that if we are living today in a multipolar world, if we are living today in a world of competing states, and we are looking at the world from the prism of a state which is emerging and which is trying to expand its influence, then actually the Chanakyan statecraft is very relevant, because that is also from the perspective of a king who is trying to expand his influence in a multi-state setting. So to some extent it is very relevant the way he is looking at how do you expand his king's influence in that kind of a competing state situation. It is very similar to what we have today.
So on the question of China, I have a question. So you mentioned that we do not have a great understanding of China and Chinese culture. Where is the lack of understanding here in India about China?
Well, there are very few people who study China in this country. So what I wanted to convey was that not only is China the major challenge that India faces today, but is likely to remain a challenge for considerable time to come. And therefore, if it is a country which is going to have a very major impact India's security and foreign policy, does it not make sense to try to study that country as much as we can, not only in terms of what its foreign policy is, but in terms of what is its history, what is its culture, what are the ways in which Chinese think about the world, what is its history, how does that, just as India's history influences the way we look at the world, how does Chinese history influence the way China relates to the world? What is happening with its economy? What is happening in society? There is major changes taking place. What are the implications of those changes? It's not only something that has to be done in the foreign ministry, looking at China's foreign policy, but there is need for a much larger effort, research effort, part of think tanks, for example, universities, academic institutions, to really focus attention on these aspects of China, which I believe today we have very thin resources devoted to it.
So you also mentioned that post the financial crisis, we are in a major inflection phase where the US is waning, China is emerging. There are also forces that are acting against trade and globalization that could mean a lot for India, especially the emphasis that we place on economic growth. So how do we address these challenges?
So one is the awareness that I think we should have that globalization is not going to be reversed. Because it is really driven by technological change. And as long as we are impacted by technological change, and we don't want to give up the benefits which we get from technology, such as the internet or the smartphone, this is something which is going to make us a much more interconnected world than we are today. And therefore, how do you manage that interconnectedness? How do you leverage that interconnectedness precisely to achieve your economic and social goals? What I have tried to argue is that the very history that we have, what I call as a crossroads culture, as a country which has been at the intersecting points of maritime routes in the past, of caravan routes in the past, we have in a sense been a global citizen since a very long time. And therefore, this is an asset that we have in dealing with the rest of the world, in engaging with the world. Because the more congested the world is becoming, those countries which have a certain advantage in managing plurality, managing diversity, being comfortable in dealing with other cultures, those are the countries which actually have a greater potential to succeed in this new world. So we should base our policies, on recognizing that we should stay ahead of the curve as far as globalization is concerned, rather than resist it like others are trying to do, or sort of fall prey to protectionist tendencies. We should actually be embracing the world much more than we are.
And lastly, I have a question. You have a very fascinating chapter on the behind the scene negotiations that culminated in the nuclear deal. You obviously played a key part in it. What is the one major challenge that you faced and that was overcome? Could you just elaborate a bit more?
The challenge was that for both the United States of America and for India, engaging in these very intense negotiations was a very new experience. It was a very sharp learning curve for both sides, because we have not done anything major or significant like this ever before. Also, in trying to get public support for this initiative, both the United States as well as India had to do things which they had perhaps as diplomats not done before. For us, it was very important that we obtained support from, say, the American Congress, from its Senate. So we spent a lot of time trying to convince them to support the nuclear deal, why it was in the US interest. We had to do a lot of work in India itself, trying to convince the public opinion, trying to influence the attitudes in the political parties that this is something which was for the benefit of India. Readjusting to a very different way of actually engaging in diplomacy, this to my mind was perhaps the biggest challenge. That we were doing things which were very new for us, and I think it was quite remarkable that we eventually succeeded. Yeah.
And one final question, how should India want the world to view us?
Well, I think India already does have a certain positive image in most countries as a very dynamic, emerging economy. We are a bright spot in our economic landscape where not many success stories to actually celebrate. So that's the important part of how the world looks at India. Secondly, I think one of the most important advantages that we have is how the world looks at India as a very successful plural democracy. As I said, I consider that to be a great asset. And I think one of the reasons why the world looks at India as perhaps an example to others is precisely the success that this country has achieved in dealing with very vast diversity. That it has maintained a democratic system despite the fact that there has been such great diversity. It has been able to do that against very heavy odds. So I would still like the world to see India as precisely